Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got not one, but two guests with me to discuss Russian foreign policy. Dr. Alexander Konkov is an associate professor at Moscow State University, where he works at the Department of Political Analysis. And Dr. Matthew Crosston is an expert in Russian foreign policy at Bowie State University, where he serves as the director of the Academic Transformation Devision. Earlier this year, Alexander wrote an interesting analysis with the title Rules for a Game Without Rules, in which he breaks down Russia's new foreign policy concept that was approved by the Kremlin on March 31st. Matthew then shared this paper on his social media, so I thought I would invite both of them to discuss the new document, how to interpret it, and what it means for the future of Russian foreign policy. Alexander and Matthew, thank you for coming online.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal.
So I wanted to talk to both of you because this foreign policy concept is one of those publicly disseminated official policy papers. Sometimes they're referred to as white papers, right? That outline central tenets of national policy making. These then usually serve several purposes, as they are supposed to inform local Russian decision-making, but at the same time, they're also supposed to signal things to the outside world, which is beautifully shown by the fact that this policy paper was published in about 6, 7, or 8 languages, you know, and English being one of those. So it's clearly also meant for foreign consumption. So I was wondering about both of your interpretations and see what kind of discussion this will render. Maybe let's start with you, Alexander. Could you tell us, first of all, what this foreign policy concept is, what it says, and how it is different from earlier versions of the same document?
Well, indeed, foreign policy concept is quite a traditional document for our country. This one, which was published several months ago, it's the 6th one. Generally speaking, I would say that would even differentiate concepts made by Yeltsin, by Putin, by Medvedev, another term of Putin, and so on and so forth. But seems to me the most important thing is that foreign policy concept is a very key document to understand what are Russian ambitions in outside world. On the other side, foreign policy concept is not the only doctrinal document for Russian policy in general. So we have many strategic documents within country dealing with internal questions, internal issues, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, coming back to your question, whether it is outside or inside, whereas the audience of this document is both. So of course, the primary goal is to consolidate Russian diplomacy into some directions where to go these years, but also to demonstrate for audience outside country what are Russian goals, what are Russian national interests, tasks, directions, priorities, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me the main thing to understand is whether you're interested in Russian foreign policy, this document is a must to read.
And so what's the biggest change to previous documents, or the biggest change, therefore, in Russian foreign policy?
Well, quite many differences. I guess I would even say that compared to previous versions, which maybe were not were quite similar to each other. So I mean, every new version was a bit similar to the previous one, but this one is quite different from all those we had before. So different structure, different approaches to define priorities, different countries mentioned within the text. But if I would pick up the most important thing, seems to me it's a clear structure of priorities. So we have national interests. We have well, around nine national interests. We have 3 strategic goals, all Russian diplomacy of all people and bodies involved into foreign policy. And we have around 14 tasks so which are to realize all those goals and interests. And also there are 9 priorities, strategic priorities, directions of foreign policy of the country, and seems to me 10 regional priorities. So also quite a new regional structure, structure of regional priorities for the country, also to think about, and not just to read and take it like that. So quite difficult in this sense.
And so to you, it's a big change from the previous one, right? Matthew, did you also study it? And how do you view this the reformulation of the document?
Well, before I begin to answer that question, Pascal, I think I want to explain also why I found the article that Alexander wrote was so important. Is largely because, in my experience, and I've now been connected to Russia since I was 18 years old, quite frankly. So we're going back a long, long time. And I've spent a lot of time over there. And one of the things that has remained consistent, and we're talking about when we're going back to when I was a teenager, it was still technically the Soviet Union. It was at the very end of the Soviet Union, but we've had transitions in power, the ending of an empire, the emergence of a new unipolar / from bipolar system, the competition for other countries now talking about the need for a multipolar system as opposed to a unipolar hegemonic one. All of this has transpired over the last 30 years. But one of the things that has remained consistent across all of that change has been, and it's been a really particular personal frustration for me, given my expertise and given my speciality, that we in the West, and in particular Americans, we tend to not follow very closely the fine work of young scholars that are coming out of the Russian Federation. And that's one of the things I've sort of taken as a personal passion of my own, is that when I come across voices that I think deserve to be heard in the West and need to be studied, I try to push them as much as I can and give voice, not to be too dramatic or sort of melodramatic about it, but to give voice to those who are voiceless in the West. And part of that is not just a language issue. It's not about, well, they don't produce enough that's in English, or that because that's not true. It's more about the sense that there always tends to be in American foreign policy analysis, especially pertaining to Russia, is, well, whatever Russia says isn't really the truth, right? So we have to instead read between the lines. We have to reinterpret what's actually written on the page, because we can't pay attention to what's on the page. Oh, no, we can't do that, because they'll never tell us the truth of what they really feel and what they're really trying to get to. So whatever, as Alexander mentions, this long list of priorities and national objectives and security interests that matter to them, and countries that they consider to be, critical touch points for their own future. No. That's a smokescreen. Like we have to wade through that to figure out what the real policy is. And I've always protested against that, because the one thing Russians have tended to largely do, and we've tended to ignore, is they are often very quick to simply say, this is what's important to me. This is what our priorities are. Please pay attention to them. Don't discard them. And our ability to sort of shove those aside has often caused a lot of problems between our two countries.
Yeah, but one of the things that needs to be emphasized here is that this document very clearly, and Alexander, you correct me if I'm wrong, is also meant for local consumption, right? I mean, it does not only inform the world abroad, it informs government ministries inside Russia, right, of what the priorities are, and it is actually stamped and sealed by the Kremlin, and I don't even know, maybe also the Duma. Alexander, maybe can you tell us something more about how this document will be used inside the political process?
Well, it's you both are right in it. I would say that many ideas are put into documents like that. Technical issues like to put together all those efforts made by different bodies, different ministers, and so on. Political, of course, political agenda, to put on the table what Russia is going to have to do, to follow. I would even say that the main thing is Russian policy is quite pragmatic in terms of how it is defined. So Russia wouldn't do anything which is not written in this concept. That's for sure. So Russia never makes any things which are not made by president, by governments, and so on and so forth, and Duma also, which you mentioned. And the final part of these documents deals with participation within the process of foreign policy, and also it puts presidents, governments, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also other bodies like State Duma, as you have just mentioned, Council of Federation, upper chamber of Parliament, also Россотрудничество, which is a special agency which is dealing with different humanitarian aspects of foreign policy. Other ministries, regional authorities, also they take part in some activities on foreign investment, foreign economic cooperation, and things like that. Different public bodies like public, I would say it's social or public chamber, public chamber, and other indeed NGOs which are also oriented at foreign cooperation, international cooperation. They're also put into this final part in order to say that government is inviting all the participants. Government is obliging government agencies and inviting civil initiatives, NGOs, and so on, to go in line with this document, with all those priorities, interests, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's quite a difficult task to put together different tasks, different ideas, different participants, but seems to me this document is quite productive in this sense, especially coming back that it's quite different from what was in previous versions. Previous versions seems to me were quite reactive in terms of their idea. So to react to what happens in the world. So something is happening, and Russia has its strategy to react at those positions. This document, this concept seems to me, again, compared to previous documents, quite proactive in this sense. So it puts all those this maybe complex framework of interests, priorities, goals, tasks, but anyway, it is put into the paper, and it is quite clear for those who address this document.
Does the United States also do these papers, Matthew? And what would you compare it to in the US?
Well, probably, honestly, the thing that most immediately would come to most people's minds is the annual national security strategy, what we call it, the NSS, which is very similar to what Alexander is saying, in the sense that there's always sort of a consistent platform upon which new versions of the NSS build off of, and there's certain expectations that there's never going to be, with, say, a new publication in any particular year that's going to dramatically or radically depart from previous versions. So it's more about reading the subtleties, reading the shades of gray that come into the document from one year to the next. Like I found with what Alexander just said was really important, was this idea of moving from something that was maybe more in previous iterations, more reactive, and is now more proactive. The way I interpret that, for example, in the new foreign policy concept, is that somewhat by default, I'm not blaming Russia for this focus, but part of that reactive past was based on the idea that, for lack of a better term, it was Russia still trying to work within the global system as presently constituted, with the United States at the very top of that global pyramid, right? So it was reacting to the global power structure as it is, rather than proactively talking about what kind of global power system do we want to see, right? And because both, in this case, both Russia and China, although they've approached it from different directions, they've both always been in agreement for quite a long time now that a unipolar system is not, in their minds, not the best, most stable, most strategically advantageous for the most actors system. So how do we get away from that? But in the past, the foreign policy concept was sort of reactive to the fact that we live in a unipolar world, and it's all about all of us trying to figure out how to interact and react to the United States, to what the United States is doing, to what the United States is prioritizing. This new concept is actually, to me, I find it quite bold. Now we'll see in time how much of it is based on reality, like how many real new measures will come out of the written plan, or is this just sort of written posturing of where we want to go ultimately? Because I think when it said proactive, you're talking about how do I envision a system that doesn't have the United States sitting alone at the top of it? What does that system look like? How would I try to help create that system and help maintain and stabilize such a system?
So when we talk about proactive foreign policy, you know, the sad matter of the fact is that in the United States, active foreign policy is often very belligerent, and often has something to do with interference and with military operations. In Russia, we've now seen what's happening in Ukraine, but I mean, that already happened before the new foreign policy concept came out, right? Actually using military assets in order to conduct foreign policy. Are you understanding it in that sense? Or because I don't read that document in that way. Let's start with Alexander. What is this new proactive Russian foreign policy based on?
Well, I agree with what the discourse which Matthew has just described. Of course, in all those words, the previous concepts were really like those, and this new one has some kind of new ambition. But to my mind, the most important thing in this proactivity is not maybe the concrete actions which are still to be expected indeed, because this is a new document, but the ideological part of it. So it is quite concentrated on notions which we didn't use, we didn't see, we didn't consider in the previous foreign policy planning. All those things like, for example, Russian world concept, or state civilization, all those are used in this text, but we didn't previously have those in official documents. As far as those were part of, you know, just civil society activities, civil society discussions, projects over different soft power projects and so on and so forth. But the idea to put those into official foreign policy statement, official foreign policy concept, just appears this time. So again, although many norms about different spiritual, moral, spiritual things, also those are getting a part of Russian foreign policy, not Russian foreign, you know, discourse, Russian foreign agenda, but policy which is defined in an official document signed by a president. In this sense, all those norms about, again, state civilization, about moral norms, which are also put by another presidential degree on the paper, and those are called Russian traditional norms, traditional principles, traditional values. So all those are now at the moment are starting to define policies, starting to define activities which are to be realized by Russian diplomacy all over the world.
Matthew, is this something like Russia's version or Russia's answer or proactive way of engaging what the West has been doing with its value-based diplomacy, which is something that has been gaining more and more traction over the last couple of years, and which I find very strange? Or how do you read that?
Well, I read it a little bit differently, in the simple sense that I think one of the important steps, and it has been a very slow evolving step, and this is again, while Russia and China are not in lockstep on every issue, of course, but on this particular area of critique, I guess you'd call it, say, American foreign policy critique or American global standing critique, there's obviously a lot of cross-meshing interest between the two countries. And one of the things that's always been important, that it's only happened, I'd say, in earnest, within the last five years. And I think the new foreign policy concept is trying to still build on that. I think there's still opportunities to be even more explicit than what it talks about. But there was this idea that, well, with the end of the Cold War, that meant, quote, democracy won, right? So, and therefore the non-democratic systems lost. So, and the United States is the greatest representor of democracy. So therefore they won. The United States won, and therefore it will dictate to everyone else what the global system will be. But it took from, say, 1992, 1991, up to the last 5 years to really I've started seeing Russia and China operate in a much more subtle zone of critique, because the Americans have certainly gotten a lot of mileage out of the idea of, well, what other system is there? Right, like, you know, isn't the famous Winston Churchill concept of like democracy is the worst possible system except for all the others, was his famous quote. So we're the best of lots of bad things, or something like that. So, but that was always thinking in sort of a binary mode, like it's either democratic or a non-democratic alternative. And what I see now embedded deeply within documents like this new foreign policy concept is a much more subtle and I think much more powerful criticism of, no, we don't want you shoving us into the corner of being, quote, anti-democratic. What we're anti is we're maybe anti the very strict, explicit American version of democracy and the American version of how democracy and economic development mesh together. And China has been very adamant about this. They're just much quieter than Russia is about it, is that they're simply saying, you assume always what America exports to other countries, or tries to export to other countries, is the most important thing are civil liberties, human rights, democratic freedoms, openness politically, and the economic development follows. And China was the first country to really push this idea of, well, that's you pushing your values onto our people. But our people maybe have a greater value about stability, order, and economic prosperity for themselves and their families. And that subtlety now is like, don't call us anti-democratic. You can call us anti-American democracy. We're not trying to be the American democratic system. We want to be able to develop and evolve our own system. That's actually finally gaining traction around what's important is not whether you convince the Americans. You'll never convince the Americans. The Americans will still simply say Russians are anti-democratic, period, end of story. But what does matter is, are these documents like the new foreign policy concept, are they hitting countries in South Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, where you're building new alliances and building new relationships? That could play out as a proactive exemplar, for example. That could have a lot of important destinies in terms of how we look at foreign policy 20 years from now.
That's a very nice point, and I'm going to ask you, Alexander, now about this, because I think what Matthew is hitting on is right. If we look at the new BRICS final document, that one states very clearly that all of the BRICS nations are in favor of democracy, including Russia and China. And Russia is, I have never heard never ever heard any Russian official saying we are against democracy. On the opposite is the case. Russia and China both are trying to say, like, no, we need a more democratic international system. Now, internally, there's a lot of debates of we can have debates. What kind of democracies are they? But both of them are branding themselves as democracies, right, Alexander? And do you see this reflected in this new foreign policy approach?
Well, it's quite an interesting approach, saying that foreign policy and democracy would be coincide in some policy, in some activity, in some documents maybe defining those things. But 2 points maybe seems to me quite important to identify this problem here. First, foreign policy concept is not the topest in terms of Russian international agenda. You know, we have national security strategy, which is the main document in this sense. And these documents may refer in some degree to values like democracy, like global things which are to define relations between nations, between blocks, between different structures. In this sense, seems to me foreign policy concept which we are discussing today is more technical in this sense. So it is like okay, just give us the idea, and we'll provide this idea through our embassies and through our network of diplomats. So if democracy would be our priority, we would follow this idea through our activity. If national security strategy would say that we should be anti-Americans, we would go this way. If national security strategy would say that we need to develop relations with BRICS, okay, we'll go to BRICS direction in this sense. So again, even though it is called foreign policy concept, it is more about how to dwell on just activity of those who are involved into this process, not to define policy itself, I would even say. So a policy is defined by a president. All those who are involved into the process of foreign policy are to realize, to make those ideas and goals be made during everyday activity. So just a small example, maybe foreign policy concept just twice mentions BRICS, which is on the agenda at the moment. So, and if you look into the text, you see that this is just general notion of BRICS is important for the country. So the idea is to put again it's all those priorities which are clearly defined in the text of foreign policy concept into everyday activity of bodies, ministries, people who are involved into this professional activity. As for values themselves, there is again national security strategy. There is a special decree on other specific national values, and so on and so forth. As for the concept, it just says that look into those values and follow according to norms and decrees which would be on the agenda.
Does the foreign policy concept or the national security concept put emphasis on international law?
Yes, of course. Both of them. As for national security strategy, it generally says that Russia is to support the international law based on UN Charter and so on and so forth. As for foreign policy concept, it says that Russia, one of the Russian priorities or priorities of Russian foreign policy is to follow international law and to obey it according to Russian national interests, which are again identified in both documents. Indeed, but the most important political thing in this discourse is according to all those interpretations, not the text itself of foreign policy concept, interpretations within country according to statements made by president, by minister of foreign affairs, of other top officials in this sphere. They say that Russian foreign policy concept makes emphasis on international law, on the contrary to the notion of an order based on rules, which is promoted by the West. So in this sense, the notion of international law put into foreign policy concept is in terms of saying that Russia is one of main defenders of international law compared to some specific order based on rules which President Putin is likely to say usually, where are those rules? Just show us those rules, because we don't know who wrote those rules and what they're about. So that's the case of international law. It seems to me it's quite important here.
Matthew, do you also think that Russia is trying to position itself as a champion of international law as opposed to the United States? Are they doing that game with that document?
Well, Pascal, you know from our previous conversations, I have a very love-hate relationship with the concept of international law and how countries around the world have been both friendly to international law and then maybe not so friendly, depending on where their interests happen to lie in any given moment. And I think that's a perfect example. Like it isn't just about the actual application of international law or respect for international law, but also populations and countries' reaction to how international law is used in official statements. And Ukraine, to me, is a perfect example of this, because for most Americans, I'll be completely honest, part of this is governed by the way it's presented in the media, of course, but also backed up and supported by statements officially coming from the United States government. For most people in America, the Ukraine situation started only when Russia entered Ukraine. And that was a violation of international law. Therefore, Russia is wrong and Russia needs to be stopped. But Russia has been very, very explicit and very, very public about laying out lots of multiple arguments showing where, in its opinion, international law had been breached well before any Russian divisions moved into Ukrainian territory, going back years and years and years. And also pinpointing, in addition to that, public statements made by President Putin, made by, at the time, President Medvedev, made by members of the Federation Council, where they said, this is not just simply a violation of international law. These are maneuvers that make us feel, us as in the Russian Federation, make us feel less safe, make us feel like our security is getting impinged upon. And that's, for them, that all led up to a point where they then felt no one's listening to us, no one's taking our argument seriously, no one's trying to invite us to a table to negotiate or talk these points out, so we will get your attention the only other way we know how. And in that particular moment, how important is international law?
Yeah.
Was international law important in the earlier parts? Was it important when they entered Ukraine? So I've always been I've been a little wishy-washy on the true relevance of international law in terms of how much it applies.
Yeah, but I think this is there's an important detail here, which is that Russia has also been very careful, in my reading, to actually keep all the formal steps necessary in order to build a legal an international law argument that it's that the invasion of Ukraine the special military operation, that those are actually in accordance to international law, right? Russia refrained from recognizing the Donbas republics for 8 years because it wanted them inside Ukraine. But then before the operation started, 5 days before, they recognized them in order to be able to say we are now helping them under the UN Charter, Article 51, the collective self-defense against the West Ukrainians, right? This is a legal, there's legality in here. I mean, if we had a real court case, you could make the argument that this is totally fine. And Alexander, maybe tell me, do I read it correctly when I think that the foreign policy concept and also security strategy emphasizes that no, Russia will keep to international law, but it will of course have its own interpretations or make its own cases?
Yeah, of course, I agree. I agree with both your opinions at the moment. I think that's first of course, international law is quite differently interpreted in different countries in different parts of the world. And the second, of course, as for special military operation made by Russia in Ukraine here, according to all the statements and according to practice, it is considered to be in line with international law. And to my personal view, international law might be considered not only as something which is only written on the paper. We all know that there are at least two main approaches to law in general: continental law and Anglo-Saxon law. Law which is written, and law as a precedent. So as a practice which is put into some continual activity. So in this sense, we could see that international law, of course, is a UN Charter, first of all, where we all know there are two principles, yeah, territorial integrity and sovereignty, and on the other side, the rights of any nation to self-realize, to find itself in this world. And there is also practice, which Matthew has just exactly described. So practice is different. How different nations, how different countries, how different international actors did practice the international law in their real policy. So Russia doesn't do anything which wasn't done by other actors in these planets before. First, and the second, Russia defends its national interests, which are written again in national security strategy, in foreign policy concepts, and all other documents, in all other statements made by officials and presidents and ministers and so on and so forth for the latest 20 years. So it seems to me that in this sense, Russian foreign policy at least is quite consecutive and go in line with all the previous steps to put on the paper all the threats, all the risks, all the interests, all the ideas of policy based on some principles which are identified within the nation.
Matthew, do you want to react to that, or like how do you? Or let me put it into a question. Like, if we look at we talked about this in the beginning. Do you trust what comes from Russia? And I think in the West, currently the view is you cannot. But I view actually Russian foreign policy as relatively transparent, actually, in terms of like what their goals are. You can go and read it on the homepage of the Kremlin, and you look also what like previous documents. They're quite clear. Do you see it like that too, or not?
No, I've long stood on that platform, and quite frankly, over here in the United States, I've stood on that platform for a long time by myself, completely alone. Because it's like I've had this conversation. In fact, earlier this spring of this year, I was presenting and I gave a speech at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, and they were asking me to talk about the current situation in Ukraine. But what they didn't tell me is they actually had on campus a whole group of Ukrainian, what they were calling Ukrainian refugees, attending school there at Creighton, and they invited them all to the talk, but they didn't let me know that. So they told me right before the speech began, and I said, well, listen, I have to be honest with you. I'm not sure they're going to like everything I have to say in this speech. So I hope you're ready for fireworks at the end when we get to question and answers, because they might not really enjoy it. Because, for example, part of that speech is where I said, for people who think this is just out of the blue, or it was such a surprise, what this special military operation, so forth and so on. It's like, well, I think President Putin always said, there's something different about Ukraine when it came to flirtations with NATO, working with the European Union to establish better relations with them as opposed to good relations with the Russian Federation. And I was like, well, Poland is a member of NATO. The Czech Republic is a member of NATO. The 3 Baltic states are members of NATO. Hungary is a member of NATO. And Russia didn't like any of those developments. It didn't come out and say, awesome, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia is now a member of NATO. That's fantastic. Russia didn't do that. Russia was very unhappy about it, but it didn't attack those countries. It didn't invade those countries. So to me, at least this was my opinion, is that when Putin comes forward to these international bodies and say, listen, I need you to understand, Ukraine holds a different place in terms of what it represents to our region, to our neighborhood, to our country, to our people, compared to Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. It's not the same. So don't treat it as the same, and out of respect, whether it's perfectly in line with anyone's interpretation of international law or not, I'm telling you transparently and explicitly, it will be different if you try to do in Ukraine what you've done in all of these other Eastern European countries. And the United States reaction to that was, quite frankly, nah. They're just like, whatever. It's like, no, I don't. Now, maybe they were saying, yeah, but you let all the other countries go, so we think you'll back down and let Ukraine go too. Maybe the United States thought that, but I think instead it was just simply a general lack on a position saying, well, we'll listen to countries we respect, and we'll take their positions and their opinions into consideration when we think they have a value for us to pay attention. So there was definitely, I mean, there's oftentimes in the United States, there'll be little discussions about, well, Russians are always paranoid, right? The Russians always think really strange conspiracy theories against them. But that famous line of is like, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't following you, right? Like there's certain aspects in Russian foreign policy where you can be paranoid, but you can also be right.
Yeah, and we also must say that the West lacks strategic empathy at a degree that is utterly ridiculous to me. It's ridiculous to me to think that Russia is paranoid if you have been invaded 3 times over 200 years, and last time it cost 27 million of your citizens. I mean, there's a reason there to kind of to be afraid or to have security concerns, no?
And I don't want to take up all the time for Alexander, the actual Russian member of the panel, but I do want to say that I don't have to go that far back. I don't have to go back hundreds of years. I can simply go back to the last 30. And I can even then take a subset of that and say in the last 10, that there is no doubt, because again, what we're talking about, Russia has always been very transparent and very explicit about what it doesn't like in terms of Western actions. Like, it will tell them straight up. It isn't subtle about it. And the problem has not been that Russians don't let us know what they feel. The problem is we've ignored those feelings. And so it leads you then, you have no choice at that point but to ask yourself, as the Russian Federation, why do they do that? Why do they ignore what we're saying? Either they don't think we're relevant enough to be paid attention to, or they are actively trying to shove us off of the global stage. because they don't want us on the global stage. And I just think if you look over, and that's why the original paper that I pushed forward across my social media channels from Alexander was so important to me, was because not only was it simply well written and objectively reasoned, it showed rationally. That's the important part. Because it's sort of the Trump card in America is always pulling out the R card, the rationality card against Russia. It's like, oh, well, yeah, but they're being irrational, so we're not going to pay attention. But there's really great work coming from young Russian scholars that is completely rational. That's completely objective and dispassionate analysis. And we need to pay attention to it, because that's where the opportunity for negotiation, the opportunity for new relationships can develop. If we just want to stay stuck, I've written about this, you know, Pascal, many times. If we just want to stay stuck in 1963, and have the world look like 1963 forever, then we just need to keep doing what we're doing, because that's what we're doing. Our actions develop this animosity where Russia and America are eternal enemies, and maybe they don't fight, maybe they don't directly fight in a war, but they'll never actually be helpful to one another either. And I've always found that to be problematic for me.
Alexander, do you want to react to that?
Well, seems to me we have quite interesting, quite unusual conversation in the times we were experiencing now. But seems to me, well, of course, I agree with this rational idea of Matthew. But seems to me that rational policy is the goal which Russia has been striving at since maybe beginning of Putin's years. So Putin has always said that our idea is to be pragmatic, to be rational again in international relations in terms of national interests. So every nation, every country, every state has its own national interests, and those to be understood, those to be respected, and those to be treated just in order to put your own national interests in line, not to coincide with national interests of other parties, other countries. A good example of this approach, Russian foreign policy, is in the Middle East. You know, the situation with Syria, relations with Turkey. Turkey is not a friend of Russia. Turkey is not a country which is going to be our, which we are going to be in a union with. But the idea is to find out how Turkish national interests and Russian national interests could be put together in this region, just in order to make solution for all the parties in the field, all the parties in the region. And the same indeed with Ukraine. So Russia did never say that it doesn't respect Ukrainian sovereignty. It wants to destroy Ukraine. It wants to stop Ukrainian independence. The idea was just to find out how to put together Russian interests, Western American interests, European interests, Ukrainian interests themselves. So it was very difficult to identify the Ukrainian interests, because Ukraine didn't have stable interests in the situation. Because, you know, when every new president came to power, the agenda was changed, and Ukraine is not unique in this situation. Many other countries are like those. So the idea again to make a rational policy in terms of some stable principles, stable national interests. And the idea is that in any situation there could be found some solution, could be found, if not a consensus, but at least some compromise. That is seems to me the main idea of Russian foreign policy, which evaluated, which has been evolving since the beginning of the century.
I agree. And, one of the weird things is that the West at the moment tries with all its force and power to convince people in the West, we, the audience, that Russia is highly irrational. But as you and Matthew, you too, said, no, Russia is a rational actor, is a rational player. And it's actually, these documents are part of proving, no, they actually do, they adhere to what they're saying. We just need to listen. Or Matthew, do you want to add something?
Well, it's sort of bringing us full circle, because I'm sure we're running almost out of time. To the new foreign policy concept, to me, is sort of in a way exactly an answer to that comment, in the simple idea that rationality is this seems odd, but rationality is a highly subjective enterprise, right? Because we're usually judged rational or irrational by other people. Well, those other people are not completely disinterested, dispassionate, purely objective people. They have their own interests, they have their own agendas, they have their own pursuits, and that may affect what their judgment is. So when it's sort of like, because believe me, I've been in audiences, I've been in panels and given speeches. My positions usually on Russia are not popular ones in the United States, but I do believe that they're accurate based on actual facts as events have played out. And that lets me see how the real irrationality tends to be this steadfast adherence to there's only one relationship possible between the United States and Russia. It's an adversarial relationship. We cannot get past our history, our ideological battles, our contemporary disagreements. They all will always add up to just us being adversaries. And I don't believe that, because as Alexander has written about, countries always come up with new concepts. Countries come up with new positions. And it's the job of everyone else to then to be able to pivot and react to those documents and see where are there opportunities. That's one of the big, I've always been convinced of this, going back really since the Chechen Wars. So we're talking about the early 90s. I've always been convinced that Russia has been eternally frustrated with opportunities that it thought, now we're going to become in a much better relationship with the Americans, because now we see things more eye to eye and we have shared interests. Now our relationship will start to change, only to find the Americans sort of turn away from that opportunity. Time and time and time again, going back 30 years, the Americans have always turned away from a new opportunity that could have created a new dynamic. And believe me, if things were, maybe this is bombastic and a little bit too grand, but I believe this. If the relationship between the United States and Russia was incredibly tight and close and positive, this thing happening in Ukraine right now wouldn't have happened. It would, because it wouldn't have been necessary. All of those earlier events I mentioned that Russia has been transparent about, those wouldn't have taken place if Russia and America were closer, because there wouldn't have been these sort of defense security flirtations with Ukraine that are directly aimed at Russia. You wouldn't need to do that if America and Russia were already friends and partners.
In our next discussion, we have to talk about why Russia and the United States aren't partners, or the only time they were partners is when they had to fight Nazi Germany, and then but that's.
I hope you have a few hours for that one.
Yeah, we have another time. Alexander, I would like to give you the last word in the sense that maybe you want to react to Matthew, what he just said about this love-hate relationship, or how you see how this foreign policy of Russia will now go forward with what we've got.
Well, again, I would maybe finish with coming back to the beginning. It's the sixth foreign policy concept, and of course, it's not the last one. For sure, there would be the seventh, the eighth, and so on and so forth. So nothing stays in the same place. Everything changes. It seems to me that the main idea, again, I would underline that everything is written in the text. So all the priorities, all the goals, all the tasks, and Russia would never do anything which is not in line with its strategic documents. The second thing is that the main priority for Russia is always its internal development, as seems to me for any other country. So any state, any country works for the well-being of its people, of its citizens, and in this sense, we have a number of priorities which we call national goals of developments here in this country, and those are of greater importance for the country. As for priorities in the field of international relations, foreign policy, this is just a specific part of the activity of a country. So in this sense, of course, many challenges, many problems, many sources of crisis. But again, the idea is to put all those problems and to solve all those problems just in order to promote national development, to promote the interests which the country has within inside. And in this sense, again, the Russian foreign policy found itself as a pragmatic activity, and this pragmatism would for sure go in the next versions of foreign policy concepts as well.
I wish we had more time to discuss this, the internal politics, but we have to reserve that for another time. Alexander, Matthew, thank you very much for today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.